Hey folks, uh, back again with another vlog. This is Over the Garden Wall, episodes 9 and 10, Into the Unknown and the Unknown. This is the big finale. And I'm very glad, very, very glad that this show was picked, and that I gave it a second chance. I think I mentioned back in the first video, I'd seen the first episode and not really been enthused with it and didn't really remember it. I'm really, really glad that I went back to this because this was great. And it ended really, really well. So, I'll start jumping in with episode 9, Into the Unknown. This was a flashback episode which showed how Wart and Greg came into the unknown, and this did some really interesting things. It kind of added a new element, and a really important one, that I think explains a lot about what the show's doing overall, to that combination I've been talking about in previous vlogs, the way the show combines fairy tales with fairy tale elements with elements from classic Golden Age cartoons. And I was making the argument that it's making the case that the Golden Age of cartoons is really now, which is an argument I would agree with. It's not, nearly 100 years ago now. The Golden Age isn't always in the past. Sometimes it's the present, sometimes it's the future. And I think there's a strong element of that in the final 2 episodes, because there's a lot of clues, some obvious, some less so, in Into the Unknown, that this show is not set in the present, that Wirt and Greg are not kids from 2014, 2015, whenever the show aired. They're from late 70s, early 80s. And there's the most obvious clue to that is the fact that Wirt makes a mixtape, or I guess records himself playing music and reciting poems for Sarah. And creates that For Sarah tape, whereas I don't even know what kids today would do. Would you send an MP3 file? Or I don't even know, put yourself on SoundCloud? You certainly wouldn't make a tape. I guess you might burn a CD, but do people even burn CDs anymore? That's kind of more when I was in college thing. I don't know. I'm out of touch with the kids of today. But I'm too old and my nieces and nephews are too young to be hip to what's happening today. Anyway, regardless, that's the big hint of the time period we're in. And then there's others. The way that, before he changes into his costume, the way that Wirt is dressed. Very late 70s, early 80s. And, nowadays, I think, certainly by the, 90s when I was a teenager, nerds dressed down. They wore t-shirts and jeans. But in the 70s, 80s, the stereotypical nerd would be dressed like Jason Thunderberger. The vest, the tie, that's a very nerdy outfit for the time. And then the fact that all the Halloween costumes... Well, first of all, at the Halloween party, none of the girls' costumes are sexualized. That means this is early 90s at the latest. And then they're almost... there's lots to suggest that the costumes are homemade. Certainly Wirt's and Greg's are. But, a lot of the costumes looks like they were assembled from stuff in people's closets and maybe some makeup. Or, very simplistic costumes. Nothing that's stood out as being a character, the way, say, the mascot outfit was clearly a character, whereas, the other kids were dressed as, Scarecrow and Egg and things like that. Vampire costume that was just a pair of teeth. All that sort of thing. That was, store-bought costumes were not as common 30, 40 years ago as they are now. By the time, my childhood, they're already becoming increasingly common. It was a little bit embarrassing that I had homemade costumes. And I think by the time, by the late 90s, I'm pretty sure, costumes were, for kids at least, were almost always store-bought. So that was... There were a couple that, it was clear they bought a mask. I think I saw a werewolf in there. That was clearly somebody had gone and bought a mask. That wasn't homemade. But still, overall, the majority of the costuming was homemade, which is a very 70s, 80s thing. What's a movie from that time period that has Halloween in it? E.T. Look at the trick-or-treating scene in E.T. Almost all of those costumes are things assembled from the closet or things somebody's mom sewed. They're not things that people went to a store and bought, and you can kind of tell by looking at them. Now, obviously, all the costumes in the movie were made by professional costume designers working on the movie, but it's clear that that's the effect they're going for. So what does all that mean? That we're in this specific time period, and it's specifically a time period that's a good 40 years ago. 35 years ago. And, well, the answer is, what does that have in common with fairy tales, with these old cartoons? It's nostalgia. And we've progressed from nostalgia for a time period that nobody living knows, which kind of imbues fairy tales. Fairy tales were, as I believe I mentioned in a previous video, fairy tales were originally about starting in the normal everyday world and then finding yourself in a world of magic and fantasy. Things like living in a cottage in the woods, things like a princess or a peasant or a woodcutter. These were, most people never met a princess, but princesses existed. There were woodcutters. There were people who lived in cottages in the woods. There were kids who were abandoned by their step-parents. Those were real-life things, and then a fantastical element would be added into it as a witch showed up, or fairies, or tricksy forest creatures, or whatever, or you do a favor for someone that turns out to be a magical creature. And that element has been lost over time. Now, the whole setting, for most people, the whole setting of a fairy tale is fantastical. We don't really have a lot of woodcutters anymore. So that becomes... What was once a real-world element now becomes a fantastical element. So that's why, the series starting with a woodcutter is sort of saying that, that element of the fairy tale is gone, because now the woodcutter is already a fantastical thing. And so you're starting with the fantastical and continuing with the fantastical. And then with the old cartoons, that's something that... And going back, people still treat that kind of setting, that fairy tale kind of setting, with a sort of nostalgia, even though nobody alive remembers a time that was anything like that. I'm quite sure nobody watching this has lived under feudalism. And yet there is a degree of nostalgia. People talk about fairy tale weddings. There's a reason Disney sets, most of their fairy tales in that kind of setting, or, even when they... I don't think there's any Disney princess movies that are set in a modern day setting, the closest we get is the Great Depression in like that era, 1920. Well, no, before that, 1920s. The closest we get is 1920s in Princess and the Frog. You know, that kind of thing. They're imbued with nostalgia, but it's nostalgia for something that nobody alive has ever known. And then with classic cartoons, those certainly feel very nostalgic as well. There it's nostalgia for a time that very few people alive remember. There's not a lot of people left who remember the 1930s. They're out there, but, you know, they're quite old. I mean, to remember the 1930s, you pretty much have to have been born in 1920, maybe 1925, and that would put you in your 80s, as much as 90. Most people don't get that far. Most people, you know, don't live to be 85. So now we get another one. Now we get what I strongly suspect is roughly the childhood of the people making the show. And I say that because I am a young professional starting to move into the young term no longer applying. I'll go to a period of just being a professional, and then I'll be a middle-aged professional after that. That's the way off. I've still got a good 10, 15 years before I'm middle-aged. But it's hard to hold on to the claim young professional when you're, 34. And that time period that they're showing is stuff that I was alive for, but am a little too young to remember. Talking about stuff when I was a toddler, when I was maybe, or maybe as old as 5 or 6. Stuff before I started school. And I suspect that the people making this show are about my age or a little bit older. And so this, for them, is something that is nostalgic. Either because it's stuff they saw in media when they were that age, or because they're a little bit older than me and they actually experienced it themselves. That they were maybe about Greg's age. And where am I going with this? Well, that whole nostalgia thing is gonna get to be important when we get to the next episode. So I'm just gonna quickly think if I have any other thoughts I want to say about Into the Unknown before I proceed to The Unknown. Yes I do. One thing I liked that I noticed is I am about 80% sure that, because they might have been gloves, but I think those were her hands. Certainly nobody else was wearing gloves. So I think Sarah's probably black, which is very cool, because it's a little detail that her hands are colored much darker than any of the other kids' skin. And that's cool because it costs no one nothing and has just that little bit for, any black kids watching, that they can be, obviously that's not something you aspire to. Nobody aspires to be the love interest. But black girls are so rarely portrayed as the love interest unless something's a black show, that it's cool to have one, because certainly no one aspires to be the love interest, but I think most people, obviously unless you're a romantic, most people would like to spend some time as one at some point in their life. Most people would like to think that they are someone in whom other people could be romantically interested. And so our media tend to only show one kind of person as being the target of attraction. So it's nice to have some variety there. And, it's a little thing. It's not really called attention to very much. But you get a little love triangle there of two nerdy white boys competing for the attentions of a black girl who is herself pretty nerdy. And that's awesome. The other thing I wanted to comment on is there's an exchange. As they're entering the graveyard, Sarah says to the excuse me, the girl who I think is some kind of bird. I don't remember her name or if they ever gave her name, but Sarah says to her, what is it she says? She says, "You're limiting the universe to things humans can understand." And the other girl responds, "You're limiting, basically, no, you're limiting the universe by limiting it to things, or no, you're limiting the universe by limiting human understanding." And Sarah responds, "Oh, yeah, no, I guess you're right." Which, first of all, is great because, yeah, that's exactly, I remember being a nerdy teenager, and yeah, that's exactly the kind of weird-ass pseudo-philosophical conversation we would have when hanging out. Because we were nerds. But what's interesting there is that's also the age-old conflict between the scientist and the mystic. Which doesn't have to be a conflict, but often is. Because each sees the other as limiting the universe. From the perspective of the mystic, the scientist is rejecting whole realms of experience simply because they don't have a physical referent. And from the perspective of the scientist, the mystic is abandoning reality and coiling themselves up inside their own head. And both are 100% absolutely right. So that's kind of what they're saying, that Sarah is taking the attitude of the mystic, that, you know, oh, you and your science, you reject anything you don't understand. And the other girl is giving science's answer, which is no, we're accepting that there are things we don't understand, as opposed to your assumption that they cannot be understood. We're saying, yeah, there are things we don't understand, as opposed to saying, oh, these things are magic. No, they're just things we don't understand. It's two different ways of looking at the world. It's two different perspectives. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Scientism turns out to be really astoundingly shitty at like critical stuff, you know, art criticism, literary critique, that kind of thing. It turns out to be a really bad philosophical basis from which to try to do any kind of criticism. And more mystical approaches turned out to be really bad at figuring out how things work and making the world around us do what we want it to. Our ability to do that is astoundingly limited to begin with, but certainly the sciences have done a much better job of increasing that ability than anything else has. So what I like is the acceptance, the, oh, yeah, no, maybe you're right, kind of saying these worldviews don't have to fight. They can coexist. They can go in different directions. They can be applied to different things. And it ties into some themes that I'm going to be talking about as we get into the next episode, the unknown. And this takes us back to, well, the unknown, and kind of resolves the plot threads that we've had going. We get the reveal that the soul being preserved by the lantern is not the woodsman's daughter's soul. It's the beast's soul. And that's a huge reveal. The beast, who we get to see really briefly what he actually looks like. I definitely saw, I tried to freeze frame it. It was very hard because it's such a brief flash of it, and I'm watching this in streaming video, which does not pause easily or accurately. But I definitely saw what looked like extra faces, and that it appeared to be made of wood, but like very knotty wood with a lot of holes, which is interesting. It suggests that the beast is of a kind with the forest, which makes sense because the beast has a lot of resonances with other beings, other creatures. The shape of him, the suggestion of a crown of horns, is a little bit suggestive of Heron the Hunter, which is a British, English, I believe, myth about a being, either a very powerful fairy or maybe a god, that on certain nights commands a hunt. And on those nights you do not want to be caught out in the woods because you will be hunted down and horribly slaughtered by the hunter. And so there's that. There's also, like, the way he targets children. There's a lot of the Erlking in there, which is German for the Elf King. And the Erlking steals children, tempts them away with promises, and then they are never seen again. And that's certainly something the Beast is up to here. He's offering to save someone's child or brother or whatever, but he's lying. It's really just a way to keep himself going. So this seems to be the Beast's pattern. Who knows how long he's been doing it before the Woodsman, but he traps a child, he gets them to give up, stop moving, surrender, and then the tree starts to grow around them. And then he offers to preserve the child's soul in the lantern in exchange for the other person keeping the lantern lit by feeding the wood into it. What he's actually doing is getting them to feed himself, his own soul, and keep it alive. There's a lot I like in this. I like that it's really hard for him to get Greg to give up. That they do some, he gives Greg traditional fairy tale style impossible tasks that Greg then figures out answers to. That's a motif in a lot of fairy tales. There's a Russian one I remember where the person is challenged to arrive, like the person is told to come to court, but they're challenged to do so neither on foot nor on horseback, neither dressed nor naked, things like that. And, it has answers like, you show up riding a goat, which is neither on foot nor on horseback. Or you show up riding a horse, but with one foot dragging on the ground. And you wear, like, a fishing net, so you're neither clothed nor naked. That kind of thing. And Greg has the same kind of imaginative response, which is very in keeping with his character, his refusal to give up his imagination and so forth. But the Beast still eventually succeeds in tricking him into sitting still, which seems to be all that's required. But then the Woodsman rejects him. He decides he's no longer willing to to burn children's souls to keep his daughter alive. I like that we don't see their fight. We see very little of their fight until the Woodsman is beaten. And then there was a bit there where I thought the Beast was going to get the Woodsman to attack the kids. But by that point it's too late. Wirt has already figured out, he's already rejected the Beast's offer. I love that he's just like, no, that's dumb. I'm not going to take that offer. It's a terrible offer. To burn souls to keep his brother alive. And he figured out that it's the Beast's soul, and the Woodman is not going to listen to the Beast anymore. He blows out the beast and thus defeats him. And that brings us kind of to the end of the episode, where everyone has moved on. We return to the lake, where lake or pond or whatever it was that Wirt and Greg had fallen into at the end of Into the Unknown. Suddenly we're back there, and they emerge, and they're found by the other kids and taken to the hospital. So, I mean, the surface implication is that the woods are the woods between life and death. That this was all symbolic of the struggle to survive on their part. That if they had given up, surrendered to the beast, become part of the wood, they would have died. But because they did not, they were able to struggle back to consciousness and swim to safety. You know, that's the surface obvious reading of it. But there's things there that make it a little more complicated. One is pretty clearly just a joke, which is that somehow Jason Thunderburger was drowning too. The frog, not the person, was drowning too, which frogs don't drown. They're amphibians. I found very funny. But also, like, the ending of the episode kind of belies that by going back to the unknown and showing us scenes of the other characters moving on with their lives. The woodsman reuniting with his daughter somehow. Beatrice's family being restored, which I was really surprised. I had assumed Beatrice was basically like a young adult, but she seems to have been a teenager all along, apparently, which surprised me. And we see all these scenes. So was the unknown real? And the answer is, of course, no. Because the question is not, was the unknown real? Was the unknown less real than Halloween night 1980 or whatever it was, when Wirt was running around trying to get his tape back before Sarah could listen to it? And the answer is no, it's not any less real. Because neither of them is real, because we're watching a cartoon. Which is obvious, but often people forget that. We default to this science fiction-y way of viewing things, where everything is a universe of its own and operates according to strict rules, and, there are different realities that are arranged in layers, and, within the universe of the show, this is real and this isn't, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of what I was talking about when I said that scientism tends not to be a very good basis from which to critique art, literature, film, cartoons. Which takes us to the ending song, which I thought was really interesting, the extra lines there, because the last line of the song in the first episode was, if dreams can't be real, then why not pretend? And then here it added an extra few lines, something like, it referred to memory as golden lies. And that brings us back to the nostalgia thing. This whole thing has been about kind of nostalgia and this notion of a better past and retreating back into that past and celebrating that past and saying, well, maybe live in the present. Maybe your memories are lies, because you know what they are. Memories are not recordings. Every time we remember something, we are reconstructing it. That's why it's easier to remember times when you were in a similar mood to the mood you're in now. It's easier to remember things that you experience in a similar environment to the environment you're in now, because you can use that to help you reconstruct these past things. Memory is all about reconstruction, not pulling a recording out of some kind of database where it's stored in your brain. That's just not how it works. Instead, it's got more or less instructions for reconstructing it. It's less like pulling up a video that's stored in data, and it's more like pulling out a recipe card and making the same dish that you had before. It's the same dish, but it's never going to be quite the same. It's always going to be, influenced by different things, and something that's recreated is never the same as the original. Memories are lies. So are dreams. These things are fantasies. These things aren't real. But they're golden. We need them. We love them. But we can't live in them. You can't live in the unknown. Note that that he's talking about golden lies while we're seeing all these characters from the unknown moving on and getting their happy endings. And on a very basic level, no, they didn't get happy endings because they never existed to begin with. They were products of the imaginations of the people writing the show. And diegetically, they may well have been products of Wirt's imagination, or Greg's. It doesn't matter, Wirt and Greg somehow shared their dream while they were drowning, because they both know the frog is named Jason Thunderburger, which name was given to him during the final episode. So, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because this is a story. And in a story, there's no reason for dreams to be less real than what's depicted as reality within the story. There's no reason not to dwell in memory and nostalgia or dreams and fantasies. And that's good. That's powerful. That's important. That's part of what makes stories matter. But at the same time, look at how much of Wirt's distress in Into the Unknown was because of a story he was telling in his head that had nothing to do with what was going on around him. He had a story in his head that Sarah would laugh at his tape, that she would automatically go along with Jason Thunderburger's interest in her, that Wirt was not someone she wanted to be with. He had this whole story in his head of tragic lost love, like he said in an earlier episode. And it was only ever a story in his head. We see in the episode, when Jason tries to hold Sarah's hand, she rejects him. And Jason isn't the complete package, as Wirt calls him. He's, pretty clearly just another weird, nerdy kid that's part of this circle of weird, nerdy kids. And he has a really kind of dorky voice that's really off-putting and strange. Just not to say that nobody in the history of ever could find Jason attractive, but, from the way Wirt was describing him, I thought the guy in the leather jacket that talked to Sarah was going to turn out to be Jason Thunderburger. That it was going to be the traditional, conventionally attractive jock rival in this kind of story, and it wasn't. But Wirt was building him up to be that, because that was the story that Wirt was telling in his head. Wirt was limiting the universe to things that he understands. Wirt was assuming that he knew how the universe was going to go. He was assuming that he already knew. And he wasn't looking at the universe around him and letting it correct him and show him that he was in fact wrong, because if he'd been paying attention, he would have noticed cues that Sarah wasn't interested in Jason Thunderberger. He would have noticed cues that maybe she might be interested in him, or at least friendly towards him. Those can be hard to distinguish. You have to be very careful about that. But they were cues of, something. And he could have pursued that, could have explored it, could have taken the risk, but he preferred instead to tell himself a story. And that's really what this is kind of about in the end, is not letting our lives be ruled by narratives. I mentioned a lot, well, not a lot, but I mentioned a few times noticing a distinct influence of Revolutionary Girl Utena on Steven Universe. Well, it's here too, but it's not. In Steven Universe, it was a surface level thing. They were taking visual elements, a couple places even minor story elements from the show. Here it's thematic, because Revolutionary Girl Utena is a show that uses fairy tales to talk about how we allow our lives to be ruled by narratives. We let those narratives define us instead of telling our own stories. And that's very much what's, Wirt's problem. Whereas all along, Greg has been telling his own stories. Greg has been making his own explanations, his own little world. And while he's kind of annoying and weird, in the end, he's the one most able to resist the beast for the longest. He's the one that gives the clue. And he's the one who recognizes that, hey, in amongst all this drama and thing, I stole a rock, and I should give that back. And the very last shot is of him giving that back. And yeah, it's just a rock, but the point is, that's a real thing that he did and has a moral dimension to it, and he should go and do something about it. And he's grounded. He's not getting distracted by the stories unfolding around him being told by other people. He's, in a weird way, because he's so very unfocused and distractible, but in a weird way, he's the most focused out of all the characters. Because he doesn't get wrapped up in other people's stories. He stays in his own. Which, to a degree, isolates him. He very often has no idea what's going on. But it also gives him a kind of power to resist the beast, as I was saying. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to unpack here. If I sat here and thought about it, I could probably keep rambling, but it would, at that point, just be rambling. So I think I'm just going to wrap this up and say that I really enjoyed this little series. I hope there is never any more of it ever again, ever, but that the people who made it go on to do lots of other things, which is pretty much the highest praise I can give. I'm saying there's nothing here crying out that it's incomplete. There's nothing here that demands more, but I want to see more from these people who made this. Next time will be another panel video, and then we move on to Star versus the Forces of Evil. By the time we're done with that, Gravity Falls will be long over, Steven Universe might be over, and certainly by the time we finish, if Steven Universe isn't over, I'm sure it will be by the time we finish Gravity Falls. Steven Universe Season 2, I hope not the whole series. I hope this is, just from what I've seen of Steven Universe so far, I hope it's a series that goes on for 6 or 7 years. So that's the plan. Thank you all for coming along with this ride. Thank you everyone who suggested this series. and voted for it. I had a blast, and I will see you all next time. Bye.